The real art lies in squeezing your opponent, leaving them with no moves, like a snake slowly tightening its grip. We're following the game Kasparov Ivanchuk, played back in 1995, to explore a less traveled path of the French defense, where the game becomes a masterclass in positional play. We have bishop b4 and the Winawer variation, which aims to provoke e5. When this happens, black is ready for c5, attacking the base of the pawn chain. Of course, white would like to respond with c3, but with their knight on that square it becomes a problem. And that's the main reason for playing bishop b4. Another move with the same idea is knight f6, known as the classical variation, in which white gains a tempo by playing e5. As you can see, in both variations we are happy to provoke e5. Without it, black cannot play c5, as the d5 pawn is not safe. It means no fight for the center and no compensation for having less space. Therefore, bishop b4 and e5. Now, after our typical c5, the main move is a3. After bishop takes c3 and b takes c3, there are double pawns, but also a sudden defender of the critical d4 pawn. Additionally, black is left without their better bishop and has weakened dark squares. On top of that, notice how vulnerable the g7 pawn is. Whenever the undeveloped rook and knight are left without their bishop, white is excited to play queen g4, which forces black to weaken their kingside. Those are the main issues black faces in the main c5 line. However, in this game we will see black exploring less common areas of the Winawer, the move b6, employing another common French defense idea, trading the bad bishop via a6. But before we continue, I'd want to introduce another weird move but cool idea, queen d7, aiming to defend against the typical queen g4 with f5, uncovering a defense for the g7 pawn. On the other hand, by playing b6, black's plan against queen g4 is to pull the bishop back to f8. I know how bad it looks. Loses a tempo, but still keeps their kingside pawn structure solid. It's early to tell is it good or bad, and we'll get back to it, but with inclusion of the moves from the game, a3 and bishop f8. As in the case of an immediate queen g4, the reason the bishop runs back home is to prevent white from harassing g7. The second reason is more obvious. Black has pawns on the light squares, so this is their better bishop, worth preserving. And the most important reason is related to the c5 break. In this case, white's knight on c3 is not well placed, and doubling the c-pawns only helps white to protect their d4 pawn. And for those of you still in disbelief that undeveloping the bishop is actually okay, we'll underline again why this is an exception. The purpose of bishop b4 is to force e5, which, combined with the knight on c3, isn't really ideal for white. And once the pawn is moved to e5, the mission is accomplished and the bishop can go back to defend the kingside. Of course, it is time-consuming and it's not easy to say if sending the bishop to b4 is worth it. But in a slow game with a close center, shuffling the bishop around and falling behind development might not be so easy to punish. In the game we had knight f3, knight e7. Ivanchuk was considering if bishop a6 is played, he will trade his weak bishop for white's strong one, which is advantageous. But there is no need to rush, because for white to develop and castle, they have to move their f1 bishop first, to e2 or d3, and then bishop a6. That way black saves a move. It's worth noting that in the sequence of bishop a6, bishop takes a6, knight takes a6, Black does not really save time by developing the knight on the rim. It is actually stuck and will likely move again, probably back to b8 to reach a better position on c6 or d7. So recapturing on a6 with the knight actually costs time instead of saving it. And I think it's worth underlining that this is the main reason French defense players are not always willing to go for this b6 bishop a6 plan. Back to the game, White has the upper hand on the king side, and advancing those pawns, especially the one on the h-file, is only improving their position. On the other side, Black is still waiting for the white light square bishop to develop in order to play bishop a6. Therefore, the question is what to do while waiting. Black found the solution in playing h6. This move will be necessary anyway once white advances their pawn to h5, and that's precisely what Kasparov played next. And then Ivanchuk responded by gaining space on the side of the board where he is stronger. Now white has no more useful waiting moves left, so instead of bishop e2 or bishop d3 where bishop a6 would be a quick response, Kasparov decided to preserve his strong bishop, even if it means losing some time and placing his important piece on an awkward square like b5. And if you are wondering why Black couldn't insist on exchanging the bishops by playing bishop d7 instead of c6, well, in that case, White can perform a positional trick by moving the bishop back to d3, after which Black won't be able to exchange the bishops without going back to c8 and losing more time. That's why c6 was played, followed by bishop a4 as expected. Now, is that bishop still a good piece? Not at the moment, but it has potential to get back into the game and become the best of White's pieces. The plan is to wait until c3 is played, and then move back to c2. Therefore, in case of bishop a6, White would gladly respond with knight e2, which has several advantages. It allows for castling and also clears the way to play c3, preparing for bishop c2 to be played. White's plan is interesting. However, to preserve the light square bishop from being traded for the inferior one in Black's camp, White makes several extra moves. Meanwhile, Black's light square bishop may still get into action via a6 and potentially trade itself for at least one of White's knights. Ivanchuk, with Black, however, had a slightly different plan and played knight d7 in this position. The idea is to unpin the c-pawn and play c5 on the next move. White continues with freeing up the c-pawn, which is necessary if the threat of c5 is to be taken seriously. Black, however, seizes the opportunity to expand, while the white bishop cannot retreat to c2 in one move. I must admit this is a move I'd never even consider, because the whole point of b6 in the French is to play bishop a6 and get rid of the bad bishop. This way, in fact, Black is parting with that idea, looking instead to exploit slightly awkward placement of White's light square bishop. The game continued with bishop b3, c5, and c3. Playing d takes c5 isn't an option, because after knight c6 and queen c7, White cannot defend e5. Back to the game, Ivanchuk played knight c6, White castled, and then queen c7. A somewhat strange move, but perhaps you'll find it interesting when I tell you that the queen is aiming to reach a7 to apply pressure on d4. At the same time, causing White to feel some concern or hesitation about placing their bishop on c2 in the future. White, on the other hand, wants to take time and play something discreet like rook e1, which is typically useful in the French to discourage f6 pawn break. However, there were other moves that could do more than just prevent f6. For example, bishop c2 or knight f4. And it was in this position that Black revealed their true intentions behind the b5 move, by playing c4. Ivanchuk wants to advance on the queenside and undermine white's pawn chain. That seems logical since black has more space there. However, this plan isn't usually seen as great for black because their queenside attack isn't nearly as scary as white's attack on the kingside. In other words, having this pawn chain is way better than the one black has. So, why did Ivanchuk still opt for it? Well, unraveling the rationale behind his choice is really what makes this game so instructive. We will start by pointing out the sudden drawback of advancing h4 and h5. It is now impossible for white to execute the standard maneuver of knight f4 followed by knight h5. If we'd put the pawn back on h2, then after bishop c2 and, say, knight b6, it would be possible to play knight f4, then let's say rook b8, knight h5, with an idea of bringing the queen to g4 with a dangerous attack. However, white has a pawn on h5 and cannot create such threats against g7. Another common strategy is to prepare f5. White has more space in the center and on the king side and should be looking to make a pawn break. Plus, this plan makes the pawn on h5 useful, since it stops black from playing g6. However, black hasn't castled kingside yet, so if things get messy on the kingside, Ivanchuk can always castle queenside. Now, check out this last interesting detail. Black maintained the tension in the center until white played rook e1. It was only then that black played c4, surrendering the kingside. If the rook had stayed on f1, there's no way Ivanchuk would have given up the kingside by closing the center. And I'm sure we would see c takes d instead of c4. For all beginner level players, I have to underline that this expansion and closure in the center with c4 looks tempting, but usually is a bad idea for black. And what we see on the board now is truly an exception. This exception is worth noting for more advanced players, so they can consider c4 in certain cases rather than dismissing it outright. Essentially, it's about paying attention to details, such as the move rook e1 and the pawn on h5. Returning to the game, white continues to improve pieces, but this move, even though it looks like there is no harm in playing it, actually is not good. Now, the bishop on f4 improves only aesthetically, but practically it's worse than on c1. It obstructs the f-pawn, and whether it goes to h2 or g3, it will be taking away a useful maneuvering square from one of the knights. This way of thinking could catch the interest of many beginners who tend to develop without first creating a plan. Black continued with bishop e7, and we see the white bishop moving again. Not bad, but it emphasizes our point regarding the bishop being an obstacle rather than a well-developed piece. Note that castling would be suicidal, since white could play bishop b1 and queen c2 with a quick mate. Okay, black plays rook b8, practically saying there is no white attack in sight. Now, Kasparov is finally ready to start moving his f-pawn, and black responds with the excellent move queen d8. Since white's plan is f4 and f5, in case of e takes f5 there is e6 with a discovered attack. So the move queen d8 sidesteps the threat. Also, black may consider moving their king to d7 and then slide the queen over to f8 or g8, preparing to either defend the king side or even strike at some point using the g-pawn. For that reason, white takes a cautious step, playing knight g4 here. Black continues with b4, and white takes it. Otherwise, say in case of f4, there is an interesting idea for black, advancing b3, and then king d7, with an idea to move the king to the queen side and then feel relaxed when the other side of the board opens up. But even with the exchange of the A pawns, this plan is still valuable, because only black can control the A file after b3 and bishop b1 at some point. For that reason, Kasparov decided to completely remove the b4 pawn. Then knight takes b4, bishop b1, and after bishop d7, let's pause for a moment to explain what's going on. Black is happy with the queenside being more open than it was a few moves ago. Most of white pieces are still misplaced, and the attack using pawns is not happening yet. Black, on the other side, is quickly going to generate pressure against weak b2 pawn. That's why white decided to play b3 here, trying to fix it. But it only brings more black pieces into the action, especially after b takes c4 and knight takes c4. My interest in the game ends at this point, because the opening phase has concluded. The rest of the game may not contribute to our understanding of the French defense, but since it ended in a couple of moves, we should probably see it. Kasparov played knight c1 here, which is not only aesthetically pleasing from black's perspective, but also losing after bishop a4. The queen can't go to f3 because of knight d2. And if queen e2 and queen a7, suddenly the d pawn is lost. White played knight e3, followed by trading on c4. But after d takes c and queen f1, black finally had a chance to castle, leaving Kasparov utterly disgusted by his position. And so, on move 31, he resigned. If you'd want to play this unusual b6 move in the Winawer French, the game could be a good starting point. But don't forget to check out other options white might have. Use the opening explorer and do some research on your own. And feel free to share your thoughts or ask any questions about this variation in the comment section.